introduction here. Thank you. We are going to be recording this session, in part because we have students who want to see this and other members of the community, and so thank you for your willingness to be recorded. Good afternoon. My name is Natasha Borges-Sugiyama. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and will be leading this panel discussion on the 2022 presidential elections. I'd love to thank our fellow panelists. I will be introducing them, but Professor Pedro dos Santos and Jessica Rich will be joining me in this, I think, lively conversation. And so with that, I want to just give the audience a little bit of a sense of what we're headed to do today. So Brazil on Sunday had a very significant election, and we want to be able to kind of contextualize what happened. And for those of you who may be less familiar with the ins and outs of Brazilian politics, I wanted to give the audience a little bit of a sense of what's at stake and why the election matters. So for those who are kind of wondering, you know, this is a first round election, what happens? On October 2nd, the Brazilians went to the polls to vote for president, governors, senators, representatives for the Chamber of Deputies. The presidential election was the one that a lot of people were watching in particular. There were 11 candidates on the ballot, and the winner must garner 50% plus one of the vote to be declared the outright winner. And that didn't happen. What we did see with two candidates that we knew were going to be competitive in this race, getting the top 2%, top votes. And so they will be running in the second round at the end of this month. So we have two candidates, and I'll just briefly introduce who they were and why they matter and what makes them so contentious. You have on the one hand the candidacy of the current incumbent President Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro, who is a far-right candidate, and the former President Lula, who is of the left. And they could not be more different, and they are running in a very polarized electorate. So Bolsonaro, he's a brash far-right candidate. He embraces the call of Trump of the Americas, right? And prior to winning the presidency 4 years ago, Bolsonaro was little known, despite the fact that he had nearly 30 years in office as a member of Congress. He has a highly conservative nationalist discourse. He's courted religious conservatives and the growing evangelical population. His political rhetoric is very well known. He has historically and continues to make comments that are characterized as racist, misogynistic, anti-LGBTQ. He's openly admired military generals and the law and order era of Brazil's military regime, which was in power from 64 to 88. And under his administration, he has promoted an increased access to gun ownership, overseen escalating destruction of the Amazon, encroachment of indigenous lands, and appointed a number of military officials to what had previously been civilian posts in the government. He's criticized for bungling the country's response to COVID-19. He famously declared that it was nothing more than a little cold, and spread misinformation about the virus, treatments, and obstructed COVID-19 mitigation measures. So his administration has been investigated for its handling of the COVID pandemic. For months, he's hinted that he might not accept the results and would declare that the election had been stolen if he's not declared the outright winner. So he sowed doubts about the integrity of Brazil's election machines. And observers have pointed out that his promotion of fake news is undermining the confidence of the electoral process. And his pronunciations are dangerous for democracy. So that's one candidate, Jair Bolsonaro. On the other hand, you have the leftist candidate, President Lula da Silva, who was in office from 2003 to 2010. He had been in office for 2 consecutive terms, and he was the first working class president of Brazil. He came from humble origins from the Northeast state of Pernambuco. He came to power having only had a formal primary school education, and he came to political prominence having led the Metallurgical Union and then serving as a leader of Brazil's Workers' Party. And so he would run for the presidency 3 times before finally winning. Over time, Lula would moderate his economic stance from a more left-wing outlook to one where he would embrace global markets and promised investors, both foreign and international, that he would retain the neoliberal economic framework that Fernando Henrique Cardoso had put in place, and that his efforts would be really about producing jobs, economic growth, and then providing enough prosperity to redistribute some wealth. So during Lula's administration, he benefited from a period of economic growth, in part fueled by the commodities boom and the Brazilian export sector, which did quite well. His administration prioritized social inclusion and the elimination of hunger, having widely gone and received recognition for poverty relief and reductions in income inequality. However, Lula's time in office has been overshadowed by issues related to corruption. Early in his first administration, the corruption scandal known as the Mensalão was discovered, and that was a scheme that was vote buying of members of Congress in order for the government to be able to move forward its legislative agenda. Lula was never personally implicated, but senior members of the Workers' Party were. And more recently, a very large-scale investigation into kickbacks and grafts tied to contracts with the national oil giant Petrobras, known as Operation Car Wash or Lava Jato in Portuguese, implicated high-ranking political officials from major political parties, including the Workers' Party. Lula was brought into this Lava Jato investigation. He was jailed for 580 days for allegedly having received a beachfront apartment, supposedly for helping a Brazilian company secure lucrative government contracts. Lula has always maintained his innocence, and he declared that his jailing was politically motivated. And he's running now because in 2019, the Supreme Court annulled his conviction and released him for prison, which allows him to now be a candidate for this election. So both men are a study in contrasts. They are running in a highly politicized electorate. The economy has yet to recover from the pandemic and the difficulties caused by the war in Ukraine. There are high rates of inflation and unemployment. Discontent over inequality and public insecurity are really big concerns for voters. So Bolsonaro is running as the anti-corruption candidate who promises to restore God, homeland, family, and freedom. And Lula is running on the successes that he had during his previous administration, calls for an inclusion and protecting of democracy. So coming into this, we had elections on Sunday. I mentioned that there were 11 candidates. Lula received 48.4% of the vote. Bolsonaro won 43.2% of the vote, and the election will go into a second round at the end of October. So to help us make sense of what's coming, I've invited 2 of my terrific colleagues here in the Midwest to talk about their research on Brazilian politics and what they saw with these elections. Let me briefly introduce them before I turn it over to them. So first, we have Pedro dos Santos, who is an associate professor of political science at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. And his research focuses on Brazil's democratic institutions, specifically electoral rules, the Brazilian Congress, the executive and executive legislative relations. His research is really grounded on the representations literature, where he seeks to understand how elected officials represent their constituencies. And he's written extensively on women in politics, as well as the growing evangelical population in the country. He's a co-author of a terrific book on women's empowerment and disempowerment in Brazil, which is out at University of Temple Press. And second, I'd love to introduce Professor Jessica Rich. She's at Marquette University, and Associate Professor Rich is a prolific writer on social movements, state-society relations, HIV and AIDS policy, participatory governance, and federalism. She has a terrific book, which I also endorse highly, State-Sponsored Activism, Bureaucrats and Social Movements in Democratic Brazil. And in that book, she investigates how activist organizations maintain policy influence over time. And she uses ethnographic research of Brazil's AIDS movement to explain how innovative models of collaboration between the state and society helped maintain political autonomy for those civic corporatist actors. So I've invited both of them to join me, and I won't go into an extensive introduction of myself. I have both the task of being the moderator and a little bit of a contributor, but I'm also a political scientist of Latin America, and I focus on Brazil, and my research is on the politics of social inclusion. So with that, I'm going to turn to Pedro and ask Pedro to help us make sense of what happened with these elections. A lot of people were expecting perhaps that the polls might give us some clarity, and it turns out the polls were a little wrong. I'll just turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me for an introduction. Thank you everybody for coming. Yeah, it's been an interesting last few days. So as Natasha mentioned, Lula got 48.5% of the votes roughly, and Bolsonaro got 43.2% of the vote. And that was a big surprise to Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was polling, most polls had him at 34 to 35%. So even if put it within a 2 to 3% margin of error, that result was very surprising, right? I think for everybody, right? So, and most importantly, Bolsonaro also, and we can also talk about this later, arguably Bolsonaro won a big chunk of Congress as well. So he has a good standing now in Congress. However, if he doesn't get elected president, what happens is something that we can probably talk about more later, because Bolsonaro has switched parties 10 times, right? So his allegiance may not be with any parties or even movements. So we need to see what happens there. So that's one thing. And something that's interesting that Natasha mentioned too, that Bolsonaro has been challenging the electronic ballot voting for a long time. And he did the same thing in 2018 before he won, right? And it's interesting that, the polls were wrong, right? And he got a lot more votes than the polls were saying. So now he's shifting his narrative to the polls, right? To posters, and that is the fake news, right? And just a couple of days before the election, the Ministry of Defense, so the military was going to be involved in a parallel counting of the votes, and the Ministry of Defense actually within 48 hours of the election decided to pull the plug on this plan that was in the making for 2 months almost, and that was kind of interesting, right? So then so Bolsonaro, with that bump that he got on the actual votes compared to the polls, he has used that to shift the narrative about what is wrong about the establishment, right? And now it's posters who are the problem. And just something that's going to be important to think about too is the third and fourth place candidates, right? So Simone Tebet from the MDB, which is the oldest party in Brazil, she got 4% of the votes, and Ciro Gomes of PDT, which is a left-leaning party that has been aligned with Lula for a long time, got fourth place with 3%. Ciro Gomes himself has completely distanced himself from Lula. He, in a way, ran this campaign very much anti-Lula. His whole campaign was very much anti-Lula. In a way, a lot of his speeches were used as fodder by Bolsonaro supporters for this. So between Tebet with 4% and Ciro Gomes with 3%, so this means there's roughly 7.5 million votes between Ciro Gomes and Simone Tebet, and 6 million votes separate Lula from Bolsonaro. right, for the second round election. And that's going to be the discussion I think that many people are going to be focusing on for the next, next 4 weeks, 3 weeks, and some change. Who are these people going to vote for, right? So Tabich is from a kind of a centrist party that there was a joke that a famous political scientist said that it doesn't matter who wins the presidential election, the MDB always wins the election because they were the strongest party and they were able to negotiate quite a bit. They have lost some power now, but it's still a fairly influential party. And Tabit ran a really interesting campaign, and I think if anybody is going to win, she's going to win for the next election. So I think she comes poised to coming up, in 2026. She was one of the debates were very low, right? So it was just not good TV, and she was one of the few that came out as an actual politician and not just somebody yelling at the screen. So, but it's hard to know, centrist party, hard to know where her votes are going to go to. And with Ciro Gomes, like again, the leftist party, PDT, has kind of showed the support to Lula. And Simone Tebet also officially said that she's going to support Lula's re-election campaign. There's some discussions of her even being involved in the campaigning at this point. But those 7.6 million votes are going to be the key discussion for the next 3.5 weeks. And it's hard to know. I mean, at this point, I would say, I joke that I'm a political scientist. I don't like to make predictions. Some do, but in general, we don't, right? And so I don't want to make predictions, but I do think it's really hard to think that 80% of people who voted for Tebet and Gomes are going to switch to Bolsonaro, right? Meaning that Lula will likely win the election on October 30th. However, it is going to be ugly, right? So no matter what, this next 4 weeks are going to be, these next 3 weeks are going to be pretty interesting. And I'll stop here. I'll talk about Congress later, but I think I want to hear from Jessica too a little bit. But I also want to share one anecdote. It was by Sunday night where all my groups, and for those who don't know Brazil, we have 500 WhatsApp groups that we're in, from family, friends, all those things. And most of those groups, actually, at least the ones I'm a member of, we tend to not talk about politics for exactly that reason, right? Because of the polarization that's happening. And within the results coming up at 9 p.m., the wave of Bolsonaristas posting in every single group that I'm a member of was surprising, because Lula supporters weren't doing this, Bolsonaro supporters weren't doing this, and most of it, by the way, disinformation, misinformation, right? A lot of things that are not really grounded in reality. So if anything, if nothing else, this has emboldened Bolsonaristas. And again, I like to believe that the people I hang out with or interact with are level-headed people, and this happened within that small group. And I can only imagine what's going to happen in this next 3 weeks as things get more. The stakes get big, they get higher for a lot of people, in a lot of people's opinions, right? And we're already seeing deaths, on both sides, killing and deaths on both sides during this campaign. So one thing that I'm really worried about is this next 3 weeks, the violence that can come from this. It won't be like a major violence, a major protest or anything like that, or a coup or nothing like that. But there will be pockets of violence that I'm very worried about it. So I'll stop here because I want to hear from Jessica, and I can talk about Congress a little more later.
Great. So this is Natasha. Should I chime in next, or did you want to chime in first?
Go ahead, Jessica.
Okay, thanks. Pedro, I'm actually delighted to hear from you, and I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts about what's going on. So I'm, as Natasha insinuated, I'm not, in political science, we like to focus on our specialties, and I'm not an elections person, I'm not a Congress person, I'm not a president's person, but I do follow Brazilian politics. And so what I was thinking about in terms of what I could contribute today was to actually really do some, not predictions, but some, I don't know, prognosticar un poco about different scenarios going forward, given what we already know about this first round set of elections. So the first thing that I'll just add, because this took up a lot of media attention in recent weeks, is the thought of like, oh, will there be democracy in Brazil after the second round? Will the military, impose a coup? And I think that's very unlikely to happen. I do not think that that's a likely scenario. I think what Pedro was saying is much more likely is there will be some degree of violence in the streets because of all of this inflammatory behavior that Bolsonaro has been stoking and his supporters have been stoking through social media, combined with the extreme increase in the number of guns in people's hands. So that's not a scenario that's hard for us as Americans to imagine occurring in this really polarized election. What I thought I'd spend some more time thinking about is like the possible future for policies that I really care about and that I hope a lot of people care about, which are the kinds of policies that Natasha writes about, which is kind of, policies that foster social inclusion, policies that promote human rights, social policies, and policies for environmental protection. These are areas that Bolsonaro has really targeted during the last 4 years. He's done a lot of damage to a whole bunch of programs. And so I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about the damage he's already done and about what kind of, what might happen in the future. So just as an example, one of his main targets of attack has been the environmental ministry. I think if you want to think about outcomes of, backing up. There's different strategies that Bolsonaro has used to attack programs like environmental programs, health programs, human rights programs. One way that presidents can attack these programs is through legislature, through passing new laws. Bolsonaro hasn't been super effective, I would say, in that regard, because up until now, you have the House and the Senate. The Senate has been serving as kind of a block on some of the more radical legislation that was coming out of the House. So what are other ways that presidents can attack programs that they really want to destroy? Well, one way of doing it is by dismantling the bureaucracy, because you don't need to pass legislation to do that. So similar to what Trump was doing in the United States, Bolsonaro was using his powers of the presidency to defund a lot of programs. He introduced major cuts into really important environmental protection programs and for programs that were protecting indigenous lands. He also used his set of political appointments in order to put a lot of members of the military into the bureaucracy. I was trying to look up the numbers very quickly on the number of political appointments that Brazilians have, but it's a very, very large number. So whereas the United States presidents have a smallish number of political appointments that they can use, and they kind of put in their appointees to the very highest echelons, Brazilian presidents have, in the realm of tens of thousands of political appointments that they can use. So for example, if you look at the health ministry, I don't remember the numbers, but he's basically filled the health ministry with members of the military. And then another way that the president can attack programs that they really care about is simply through rhetoric, right? So by slandering programs that focus on, human rights protections for LGBTQ, for women, for racial minorities, and it's sort of unclear as to how this negative rhetoric really affects policy or action on the streets, but certainly it's some sort of really negative effect. So Bolsonaro's done enough. He's done a lot by really attempting to dismantle the bureaucracies that had been built under prior administrations in order to try to include and serve the interests of marginalized people. He's also used a lot of really inflammatory rhetoric to kind of stoke violence against different kinds of marginalized groups. I don't know how much he's actually done through legislative action, but I would say that it's actually less so up until now. So why do I say that? I say that because in addition to the presidential first round election, we also had congressional elections. And that's a really disturbing scenario when you think about the outcome of that, because there was a big win for conservative parties, and especially for politicians who belong to parties that were allied with Bolsonaro. And so if Bolsonaro wins the presidency, he's going to have a lot easier time passing legislation, because now you've got a majority of either conservative parties or parties allied to Bolsonaro, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, both in the House and in the Senate. So there will be an easier path for Bolsonaro to launch even more destruction in the 4 years to come if Bolsonaro wins the second round. So that's one scenario. Bolsonaro can pass legislation that like contributes very rapidly and radically to environmental devastation, for example, to defunding of healthcare and to other kinds of programs. However, I don't think it's particularly likely that Bolsonaro is going to win. I mean, as Pedro was saying, the polls suggest that Lula is going to win. He has a much easier path to, election, knock on wood. But even if Lula wins, I think that it's going to be hard for Lula to pass legislation, specifically because of this conservative turn in both houses of Congress. So, we're sitting here in the United States, so it's easy to make a US analogy. You had Biden take the presidency after Trump, and he had both houses in his favor, yet still had a really difficult time passing legislation. Now, if Lula takes the presidency, he's not going to have both houses in his favor. That said, Lula is a very adept politician, and he's really good, at least historically, at coalition building. And so, it's possible that he'll be able to pass some legislation that, kind of rebuild some of the programs that Bolsonaro was attacking. But beyond legislation, what Lula can do, much more easily is re-empower these government programs, these executive agencies, these bureaucracies that were in charge of protecting the environment, protecting indigenous populations, promoting health policy. I mean, he can refund bureaucracies that have been defunded. He can use his arsenal of political appointments to, rehire civil servants, bureaucrats who have policy expertise, who probably, many of whom I would imagine who were already in the bureaucracy before and possibly left during Bolsonaro. It's not an unlikely scenario that they might come back into the bureaucracy. And so you can see a reconstruction of these programs. So, we'll see going forward. I guess the executive summary is that, in addition to this presidential race, I think it's really important to think about the congressional races and kind of the added barriers, regardless of the outcome of the presidency, that this is going to have for more progressive policy in Brazil.
Thank you. That's really terrific, and it really dovetails with something that I kind of wanted to talk about, which was the big social policy that I've been following, which is a conditional cash transfer strategy to address alleviation of poverty. Because I think that you get with that one policy arena a chance to really think about how these two different politicians have conceived of and prioritized and sought to include the poor, and for what purpose, right? So Lula, as I said in my intro, really made elimination of hunger and poverty one of his main political agendas when he was in president. He created a big national program called Bolsa Familia. It is the world's largest conditional cash transfer program. It did end in 2021, but between 2003 and 2021, it ran fairly methodologically and had a very clear set of criteria based on income, and monies would be made available to primarily women, heads of households, on a cash basis, assuming that they were complying with behavioral modifications that were thought to advance human development. So for instance, mothers would get prenatal health checkups, postnatal health checkups, where they were encouraged to breastfeed, children were required to go to school, get nutritional checkups, vaccinations. So a host of social services were tied to this cash program. And it's probably one of the most widely studied social policies. It's been studied by economists, sociologists, development practitioners, and that program was widely credited with improving school attendance rates, reducing infant mortality, improving maternal mortality, improving nutrition. Turns out people did things like buy food with the monies, right? So, and the regularity of the payments also became important. So you have that model, and once Bolsonaro comes into office, he has a much more conservative outlook. He embraces fiscal austerity. They start trimming the rolls significantly, eliminating an extra million beneficiaries. So while it's still a large program, it gets significantly trimmed under his administration. And then after the pandemic hits, that's when you start to see lots of tinkering and experimentation. You start not enforcing those conditional requirements. And then there's an immediate infusion of cash grants monies, which actually goes to a wide group of eligible people, including people who are in the informal sector and unemployed, as a temporary cash relief under the emergency program Assistência Emergencial. That massive expenditure, 4% of GDP, is not sustainable over a long term. And so then Bolsonaro transforms the Bolsa Família program into what he calls Auxílio Brasil. It's his new program. It looks a whole lot like Bolsa Família, except all that conditionality is not unenforced, right? And the expenditures that are important to sustain the complementarity of services that Jessica's talking about, healthcare expenditures, social assistance expenditures, that is very weak. And we've seen kind of a lack of prioritization in those areas. But importantly, rhetorically, the ways in which they talk about these programs are also really different, right? Lula had much more of a social rights framework, that people had a right to these programs, that they were an obligation on the part of the state, that no one needed to trade their votes to get access to these programs. Whereas Bolsonaro really talks about it in the terms of charity or assistance, not in terms of rights. So there's a different framing. Importantly, Monday after the election, Bolsonaro announced that he was going to advance payment in October, so that everyone's payment, which was increased before the election to Auxílio Brasil, was going to be completed before the second round. So he's anticipating that October payment for about a quarter of the population that is receiving Auxílio Brasil. He increased the number of people who are eligible. Famously, he doesn't do as well with poor voters in the Northeast. That's a bastion of support for Lula. And this is a pretty clear effort to gain electoral support and to tie benefits to what his administration can do. I will share that I've done a lot of research with beneficiaries of cash assistance programs. I don't think it'll work. I think people are pretty savvy, and they think that they know who they voted for and why. And this isn't going to be that small margin that Pedro was talking about. But they are dramatically different in how they think about social policy. And there are pretty profound implications, not only in terms of the framing and the rhetoric that they use, but also the potential future financial commitments that I think that they're prepared to undertake. So I'll leave it at that. I want to make sure we have a terrific audience. I want to make sure we have time for questions. If you do have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. But I want to ask a question of Pedro first, if that's okay. And that is, because you study women in politics and the evangelical voters, women make up the majority of the electorate in Brazil. There's also kind of a gender distribution of evangelicals. I'm wondering if you could walk us through a little bit about thinking about kind of the gender politics dynamics at play here. What are you seeing?
Sure, yeah. So from a numbers perspective, and who was elected, right? So the numbers are not very encouraging for women. Only 4 women were elected to Senate, and there were 27 senators elected, so 14%. Only one woman was elected governor in the first round of the elections, and 2 will run for the second round, and they think both of them are going to win, which will bring the number to the highest ever women governors, right? So 3 out of 27. about 91 women, or 17.7% of women, were elected to the chamber of deputies. Something that was actually super interesting is that 2 trans women were elected for the first time to the chamber of deputies. There have been women running, trans women running at the local elections, and both of these actually were local representatives before becoming federal deputies. But and what I study a lot, especially with Christine Wiley and Malugato, is the party resources allocation to women, and that story is the same. Women receive very limited support from the parties. There's this phenomenon of extreme non-viable candidates who win 0 to 10 votes. They tend to be women to fulfill a candidate gender quota law that exists. There have been changes in the law to kind of force parties to provide the party funds to women during the campaign. But parties have, and I can talk more if people are interested. Parties always find a loophole to do this. One example that is not about women, it's actually about race, is that now parties, the number of Black and brown people running for office is going to be the determinant of some of the party funds that come from the government. So the government has a electoral party fund for the elections, and there's been an explosion of elected people who are Black or brown, to Congress. But if you look at the picture, it looks just like the U.S. Congress, right? So these are people who declare themselves to be Black or brown, but have just now declared their Blackness or their brownness. They have been out declaring themselves as white before, and they changed the declaration because it is self-declaration, auto-declaration. So that's something, and this is all again related to the campaign finance aspect of it. The evangelicals, right now they're still kind of trying to siphon through, and the tricky thing about talking about evangelicals in power is that there's no box to check for evangelical, right? So you check for gender, check for race, but there's not a box check for evangelicals. But from most estimates that I saw on the news, there are roughly 20% of those elected to the chamber deputies were evangelical, or self-declared evangelicals in a campaign or something like that. And this year, the evangelicals have been emboldened, and they really want to reach a descriptive representation in the House, especially that is similar to their representation on the population, which is 33% at this point, roughly 33%. So there has been also an emboldenment and a mission, kind of like a more, even though evangelical is a broad umbrella group for a lot of people, there is kind of some efforts, especially by the more conservative evangelicals, to have a clear mandate, a clear policy proposal, and things like that. So this gets to your question about evangelicals and gender. Bolsonaro still did poorly, it seems like it, with women evangelicals, especially women evangelicals who are poor, who are earning less than 2 minimum salaries in Brazil, who also tend to be Black women, who also tend to be from the northeast, or in the suburban areas in the southeast, and then that tends to be the places where Lula got more votes as well. That was during the campaign, they brought Michelle Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro's wife, to campaign quite a bit. Bolsonaro is actually Catholic, right? But his wife is evangelical, and she was much more involved in the campaign this year than the year prior, and it's very clear that the message is to try to bring the women vote, specifically the evangelical women vote, galvanize that vote for them, for Bolsonaro specifically. But he still didn't do as well with women, evangelical women specifically, and with women broadly speaking, they also didn't do as well.
Yeah, I had a chance to watch a clip of Michele talking on stage, and she's really quite charismatic and has had great training. She's quite comfortable now on that stage, and sending lots of messages about how Bolsonaro is really God sent, and there are lots of religious appeals, right? So and fears that are being circulated that if Lula is elected, he's going to close down all the churches. So that's one message that the Lula campaign has tried to counter and say, in fact, that is not true. He's not going to close all the churches. But there's lots of ways in which religiosity is kind of coming up in the campaign in ways that are kind of new for Brazil. Well, we have a question from the audience. Cassio, nice to see your name here. Cassio wants to know about the challenges that each candidate might face in Congress if elected. We were kind of hinting at this, right? There are, I believe, 23 different parties now represented in this elected Congress, and presidents in Brazil have to have a coalition in order to govern. And we often talk about that in terms of the Centrão and needing to have a coalition to govern and to pass budgets. What do you think?
Yeah, and actually I went to find a definition of Centrão, because for, as Tonja being said, Brazil is not for beginners. So you need a glossary every time you read the news. So for those who don't know that as much about Brazilian politics, Centrão is like this informal bloc of deputies and senators who are mostly from center and center right parties, but really that they don't, ideology is not really important, right? They kind of go with whoever's in government, through this coalition building, especially to be able to gain, power, political power, money, whatever it is. And there's a lot of issues with how that works. That was kind of the joke that people say, like, the MDB always won because the PMDB was, back then, was the largest Centrão party, a center party that really was just aligning with different places. And arguably Lula's issues came from the Centrão, right? Because the corruption scandals that happened throughout his administration and later also around Dilma's administration were about kickbacks to Congress members that were very much in this what we now call Centrão. I don't think we used to call that Centrão in 2006 and 2008 when those scandals happened, but that's what it is now, right? So yeah, so I think that so Lula has a much more will have a much harder path to govern, right? Because of Centrão is still strong, and whoever wins needs Centrão no matter what, right? To govern. But also Bolsonaro elected a lot of people from his own party and people who were kind of supported by him. Now, here's where this is what I really don't know, right? Because let's also remember this, anybody here who followed Brazilian elections, do you remember PSL? Right? It was the party with the most seats last year. The one most of last year. I forgot to look here, but they didn't win the most seats this year, right? Because that was Bolsonaro's party for 2018. Now PL, which is his main party now, gained all the seats. But even during his administration, PSL did not necessarily, a lot of people left, right? PSL, and that was not the same party cohesion that happens with the Workers' Party. That happens to a certain extent with MDB as well, and that happens with PSDB when PSDB was in power, right? So that's the one thing that it would be interesting to see, if some of these people who are now conservatives and are now elected by the Liberal Party, by the PL, by Bolsonaro's party, if they're going to become Centrão, if Lula is elected, and they were actually going to try to get what's best for them, which again, it still makes it hard to govern, but makes it more manageable for Lula to be able to govern that way. Or if they are actually going to become this antagonistic party like we have Republicans and Democrats in the United States, right? That's something that I do not know the answer. It's super interesting to kind of see what's going to happen, but I think Lula is going to have a hard time. However, the other thing that's important to remember too is that the Workers' Party also is coming back, right? The Workers' Party is arguably the only party that has this party institutionalization and party people affiliated with see affinity with the party in ways that the other parties don't have, right? And they are back to the same numbers they had in 2014. Right, both at the federal level, but also the state levels, right? In the states, they also have that. So that's kind of interesting too. That the left is kind of seeing, and the organized left, through the Workers' Party, is seeing more of this. So Lula may struggle to govern, probably more than Bolsonaro if Bolsonaro wins. But he also, I think he has the skills, and he has. There's enough people who don't care about ideology in Congress. That he will be able to govern, maybe not the way that most people would like him to govern, right, in the left, but he will be able to govern in a government that is at least center left, right? So.
Right. I think you were saying that, Jessica made a point, like Lula's a very skilled politician and very adept at creating those coalitions. At least he has been historically. Jessica, I wonder if you want to take the question about what we might anticipate if Lula wins in terms of investments and in different policy arenas. We had a question about education, but I wonder if you want to take education and or other areas as well.
Yeah, sure. And I had a question for Pedro again, or for you. I was just that was kind of tagging on your great answer. But I'll answer the question first. I mean, I don't really know, but there has been, so there's one thing that happened in 2019, which is that there was like a constitutional amendment that passed that was seen worldwide as an incredibly like harsh austerity measure. And it basically froze government spending with certain exceptions, but just to simplify, for, except for adjustments for inflation for a span of like 17 years. And a lot of the criticism about this incredibly harsh austerity measure is that it would be really bad both for health spending and for education spending, and that those two areas would suffer. Obviously, you see this become even more problematic if, for example, a global crisis such as a pandemic happened, and there's it's a new emergency in which you actually have to spend more in order to deal with the crisis. Obviously, there's ways to allocate funds for emergency spending in Brazil, but what happened was this crisis that's not only a crisis of health, but it's also a crisis of education, generated new discussion and new debate about whether we could roll back this constitutional amendment. And that's one of the things that Lula, I think, has recently discussed. I don't know if it's a promise, which is that he would try to abolish this limit on spending. And so, that would potentially do a lot for basic education in Brazil. I mean, it's not like Brazil spends nothing on basic education. I think it's kind of like middling in terms of its spending, but it certainly could stand to spend more. I think we could witness major improvements. So, I'm not really sure what will happen with basic spending, but if he managed to get rid of the PEC, I think that would do a lot. And as Pedro was saying, a lot of it depends, I think, on how he manages the Central. Which brings me to my question for Pedro, actually, which is, so Lula is an incredibly adept politician. And sometimes when I look at president here in the United States, I think, how would Lula have managed, building this big umbrella, big tent coalition? I mean, he's just very good at this. But we're now in this post-Lava Jato world. And so I'm curious to know your perspective on, now that we've had this major corruption scandal that's exposed this like widespread set of government kickbacks, and Lula's promise that we're in an anti-corruption era, how this might affect his ability to build coalitions and pass policy, and are there kind of new strategies available to him? So I'm curious to know your thoughts on that.
It's a good question. I don't think I have a clear answer, but a lot of people, I think most people are kind of banking on what you're saying here, that Lula, he would just figure out, right? And I think it's fair to say that he will, and he already is. Like, Alckmin is his vice presidential candidate. Alckmin and Lula were not friends really, until this election. So he's already showing that, but again, I think it goes back to this, like, and maybe it goes back to kind of the question about education and healthcare and other expenditures, is that his government will not be a left government, right? It's going to be a center left, and the left may just be rhetorically, right? It may just be because Lula is there, he's going to be speaking about those things. So he's going to try to kind of recenter the ship, bring the ship back to, bring some funding for universities and things like that. But it's limited. He's not going to be governing on a Kamara's boom, right? So he's going to be governing in a very different moment. So politically, I think he's going to be okay, right? He's going to be able to do some things, but he won't be as as hopeful as many people are I'm guessing, right? So yeah, go ahead.
Oh, it was just something you said made me think. I'm a little bit worried that this, I mean, it's true. There's people, I think, sort of assume there's this magic with Lula where he can, build any sort of coalition, even in the most dire of circumstances. But he's really facing a much more challenging circumstance, I think, going forward if he gets elected than before, both because of all these Bolsonaro more right-wing parties that were elected to Congress, right? And also because we're not in an era of a commodities boom. And I almost wonder if like the Lula magic might almost harm him when people become disillusioned by the fact that he can't really, govern as a leftist. And, and I think there's some sort of, maybe among some people, magical thinking about what he might be able to accomplish that's not particularly realistic.
Yeah. No, yeah. And also it'll be important to like later on really think about who voted for Lula because they were anti-Bolsonaro. Right, and I'm in a couple. I'm in a couple groups where I'm there just for research sake, and one is like a Bolsonarista group, and one that is like people who are like, we just want Bolsonaro out, right? And it's it kind of went from like anybody but Bolsonaro to like a much more vocal support to Lula by last year, basically, right? But it really is this like a lot of people are voting for Lula because they don't want Bolsonaro, so it's gonna be interesting to see what happens then, right? So also, on municipal elections as well. And then again, when the time comes for a re-election to see what's going to happen with Lula. I don't know. It's hard. I mean, we are still in the biggest economic crisis of all time in Brazil, right? So I think we cannot forget that this has been happening since 2015, really, before Dilma left power, and we haven't been able to recover economically. So hopefully he'll get a luck again and does another boom of some sorts.
Yeah, I think that here the analogy with the United States, which I'm not somebody who likes to overly draw lessons from the U.S. I study Brazil, but I think because we had, I think the analogy from the United States kind of is instructive, where we had an anybody but Trump election, and Biden came to power, but then you see, all of this disillusionment because, he actually did a number of things here in the United States, but I think that people's attitude shifted once he was actually president. At first it was anyone but Trump, and now it's like, well, what are you going to do? And so it'll be interesting to see if there's a shift in attitude after he comes to power as well, and in line with a shift in expectations. I don't know.
I'll chime in with two little ideas. One is that at least if past lessons are relevant for the future, I do expect a far more normal executive branch, right? A far more normal set of ministries that have a greater emphasis on the technocracy. So some of that instability, some of that turnover, some of that, the kinds of bureaucratic politics that we were seeing under Bolsonaro, which Jessica, you talked about, is much less likely under Lula. I think he'd be much more likely to bring in his some previous administrators. It'd be a more meritocratic social service. And in that respect, you might bring just some stability, even if you don't have a whole lot of resources. It would be a more rational bureaucracy in many ways. So I'll just add that. And at least from a rhetorical point of view, Lula's rhetorical framing has always been about inclusion. And so when we're talking about education, I think he would bring back that framing. He would bring back, the need for affirmative action or support for affirmative action. So there are a host of other ways in which kind of from a substantive point of view and a rhetorical point of view, we might see some dramatic shifts. We're running out of time. We have one question here about foreign policy and how Lula might fit within the trends of the pink tide, where he had lots of friendly allies in the region, and now he's facing a different scenario. And what could we anticipate from a Lula foreign policy world? Would either of you like to take that one?
I only have one thing to say, and then I want to pass the baton, which is that's such a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I have no idea. I mean, I think you raised the kind of, the puzzle or the way in which we need to think about it. And I think you raised the fact that it's not an obvious what he's going to do. So I'm merely saying I'm curious to know the answer to that as well. Yeah.
It's it is not a pink tide, but it's also not the wave of conservatives that came in around Bolsonaro time. You know, so we have Boric in Chile. We have I'm trying to remember here now what other people. I mean, we have
Bolivia. I mean, you've
Bolivia
got-
as well.
yeah.
Yeah. You know, Mas actually came stronger now. You know, than with Evo. So we do have some like places where he can kind of like make that connection. And that is definitely a place where and people I think sometimes we kind of underappreciate how much Lula's power and charisma came from this foreign policy, kind of like, you know, how he thought about foreign policy and how he engaged with the global South, especially, right? So I think you can see more of that, you know, less of a U.S. centric and following the U.S. thing. That was present during Cardoso as well, but it became like, you know, it became a love story between Bolsonaro and Trump, right? So I want to address Thais' question real quick here, though, since we have run out of time. So the question is, Lula wins. How might the fact that he was considered guilty of theft and arrested but later released impact the levels of corruption in the next mandate? Something that's important to remember too is that Sergio Moro was elected to the Senate, right? So the person who like arguably put Lula in jail is there, and he is very vocal already that he's supporting Bolsonaro, even though they were, you know, not as friendly when he left his government. But you know, and again, the levels of corruption, this gets tricky because this becomes rhetorical and polarizing, right? It is naive to think that corruption didn't happen before Lula and they didn't happen under Lula. So one of my biggest critiques of the Workers' Party is the lack of self-critique. I was at the Workers' Party convention in 2017, so right after the impeachment, and I was impressed at how much they did not talk about what happened. Like they just kind of made themselves the victims, and there was no conversation. Okay, there was corruption. Like, how we're going to move on from this, right? So that's something the Workers' Party has not done, and Lula has not done. And maybe during this campaign, this next 3 weeks, he's going to have to do a little more, be a little more forceful into how he addresses this. But it's also naive to think that, again, Bolsonaro is arguably more corrupt than Lula, and people have just ignored this, right? Especially Bolsonaro supporters have ignored this because they have a very specific agenda, right? So that's kind of like how I see this. It's going to be interesting to see what the rhetoric, especially with some people who are very extreme anti-Lula that are in Congress right now. But also I think that, you know, the corruption, you know, it's also important to remember the corruption that was caught was because of the apparatus that was created by the Workers' Party, who, as Natasha mentioned, strengthening the bureaucracy, right? Which he will likely strengthen again. So actually, it may be better for corruption fighting, you know, having Lula in government than having Bolsonaro.
Well, wonderful questions. We may have missed some, and if we did, apologies. It's 5 o'clock, and I want to thank our guests for coming. I want to thank our panelists for offering their thoughts on this really exciting political moment in Brazil and the high stakes for this election. The election takes place the last Sunday of October, and so we'll have to wait with bated breath to see what happens. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.